Off the southern coast of a small Japanese island, at a depth where sunlight barely reaches the seafloor, lies something that shouldn't be there. Giant stone steps, flat, level platforms, corners that look almost perfectly square. From the right angle, it looks like the ruins of an enormous stepped pyramid. Some call it a sunken city older than the pyramids of Egypt. Others say it's simply rock that the human eye has mistaken for architecture. Who's right? The island is called Yonaguni. It's the westernmost point of Japan, roughly 100 kilometers from Taiwan. Just off its southern coast, at depths of 5 to 25 meters, sits a structure that has kept scientists arguing for almost 40 years. Today, thousands of divers travel here every year. Most of them aren't chasing coral reefs or exotic fish. They're chasing a single question, one they want to answer with their own eyes. And nearly everyone who sees the structure for the first time has the same reaction. This can't be nature. It's too flat, too regular, too deliberate. But is it? In 1986, a dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting the coastline for a new dive site. Nothing more dramatic than that. What he found instead was a massive rock formation that looked like it had been cut with tools. Steps, terraces, flat, angular faces. The news spread fast. Researchers, divers, and journalists began arriving on the island. And almost immediately, one question took over. Is this architecture? Or is this geology that simply happens to look like architecture? The commonly cited dimensions are impressive. Roughly 150 meters long, 40 meters wide, and 25 to 27 meters high. These are estimates. Different surveys describe the boundaries slightly differently, because unlike a building, this structure has no clearly defined foundation. For comparison, that's roughly the length of 1.5 football fields and about as tall as an 8-story building, allegedly carved, according to one theory, from a single block of solid rock. But size isn't the only thing that surprises people. It's the angles, nearly perfect right angles. It's the flat surfaces, smooth, almost polished. It's the steps running in neat, even rows, like the seating of an amphitheater. Divers seeing it for the first time often describe the same sensation. It feels less like swimming over a rock formation and more like swimming over the ruins of an ancient stadium or temple complex that simply happens to be underwater. The eye fills in the blanks. This looks like a step, that looks like a doorway. That visual power is exactly what made Yonaguni famous, long before geologists or archaeologists had a chance to weigh in. The most prominent voice arguing for a human-made origin is Masaaki Kimura, a marine geologist and professor emeritus at the University of the Ryukyus. He studied the site for decades. In his view, the structure shows clear signs of human modification, terraces, steps, what he describes as roadways, platforms even, in some of his interpretations, something resembling a gate or a stadium-like ceremonial space. By his account, individual features of the site form the outline of a larger complex. A wide main terrace, a narrow passage he calls a road, and a platform he interprets as an observation point. In one interview, Kimura even suggested this could be a surviving fragment of a much larger settlement, spread across the surrounding seabed. That's a bold claim, and it immediately raises an obvious follow-up question. If people once lived here, where are their belongings? Where's the pottery, the tools, the traces of hearths, all the things that normally survive at even the oldest human settlements? Now here's where the problem starts. If the entire complex really was built on dry land before being submerged, its age would have to be tied to a period of much lower sea levels, the end of the last ice age, roughly 11 to 12,000 years ago. That would make Yonaguni older than the pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge, older than the cities of Sumer. A staggering number, too staggering to accept without solid evidence. And here's an important detail that rarely makes it into the headlines. Kimura himself has proposed different dates over the years, including one far more recent, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years old. In other words, Even the site's most prominent advocate for a human-made origin doesn't insist on a single fixed 10,000-year figure. That older date isn't an established fact. It's a hypothesis that depends entirely on another unproven hypothesis, that the structure was built by people in the first place. So what does the other side say? Most geologists who've studied the site's imagery and geology have reached a different conclusion. Yonaguni's core is a natural rock formation. The explanation lies in the stone itself. The sandstone in this region has a habit of fracturing along straight lines, along horizontal bedding planes, along vertical joints. Tectonic stress and erosion do the rest. The result is rock that essentially cuts itself into flat faces and stepped ledges, without a single tool ever touching it. Geologists sometimes call this kind of breakdown pseudo-blocky jointing. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. When a rock is uniform and well cemented, and its fractures happen to run at roughly right angles to each other, the result is almost inevitably rectangular, no human involvement required. This isn't rare. Similar formations exist elsewhere in the world, places where sedimentary layers of different hardness erode at different rates, leaving behind clean, step-like edges. What sets Yonaguni apart is scale. It's far larger than most comparable formations, which is exactly why it feels so much more convincing. There's one more name worth mentioning here. Robert Schoch, a researcher often associated with alternative theories about ancient history, including his controversial redating of Egypt's Sphinx. On paper, he seems like the perfect candidate to champion the sunken city theory. But after diving the site himself, Schoch concluded the same thing most geologists had. The core structure is natural. He allows for the possibility that isolated sections may have been slightly modified by people later on, not built from scratch, but perhaps touched up. According to Schoch, the likely explanation is a combination of natural factors working together. Layered sandstone, two intersecting sets of tectonic fractures, and constant wave and current action that has spent thousands of years polishing surfaces that were already relatively flat. In other words, where sunken city advocates see deliberate design, geologists see a rare but explainable overlap of several ordinary natural processes. That matters. Even a researcher known for pushing back against mainstream dating of ancient sites didn't find enough evidence to call Yonaguni a man-made city. So what about hard physical evidence? There isn't much, not the kind archaeology usually requires. The monument has produced no widely accepted archaeological finds that would reliably prove human construction. No convincing pattern of tool marks, no mortar, no evidence of individual blocks being quarried, moved, and stacked, no inscriptions. No datable cultural layer. Compare that to any confirmed megalithic site, Baalbek, the pyramids of Giza, Stonehenge. Everywhere people genuinely built with stone, they left behind telltale signs, characteristic tool cut marks, evidence of transported blocks, visible seams where separate stones were joined together. At Yonaguni, none of that exists. What you find instead are fractures running straight through the bedrock itself. The kind of continuous break you get from a natural joint, not from the seam of a wall. And that leads to the core geological argument. This is a single, continuous outcrop of bedrock, not a structure assembled from stones brought in from somewhere else. In other words, nobody built this. The rock simply turned out this way. So if the evidence points so clearly in one direction, why does the debate refuse to die? Because the human brain is remarkably good at spotting order where none was intentionally designed. Straight lines, symmetry, repeating steps, all of it reads as engineered, even when it's the product of entirely blind physical processes. There's also a middle ground theory worth mentioning. Maybe the monument really is natural, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that people used it later, as a landmark for sailors, as a site woven into local tradition, perhaps even as a ceremonial location. There's no direct archaeological proof of this, but this version doesn't require inventing an unknown super-civilization. It explains the site's strangeness without rewriting known history. It's convenient precisely because it doesn't ask us to discard a single established fact. It simply adds one small human chapter on top of a purely geological story. No pyramids, no lost cities, no forgotten technology. That's exactly why many researchers see it as the most plausible middle ground. Unfortunately, the cautious version of the story almost never makes headlines. Yonaguni quickly became a favorite of documentary filmmakers and alternative history channels. Theories multiplied: a sunken Japanese Atlantis, a vanished Pacific supercivilization, an ancient culture erased from memory entirely. The problem is that none of these ideas are backed by convincing archaeological evidence. They're stories that sell extremely well and hold up extremely poorly under scrutiny. Why does this keep happening? Because a story about a forgotten super-civilization is always more compelling than a story about fractures in sandstone. One promises mystery. The other reads like a geology textbook. Media tends to choose whatever holds attention, not whatever most accurately describes a rock on the ocean floor. It's also worth noting that other underwater formations near Yonaguni and nearby islands were, at various points, floated as possible artificial structures too. Most of them, on closer inspection, also turned out to have natural explanations, which says a lot about how easily unusual geology gets mistaken for forgotten architecture in this part of the world. So where does the science actually stand today? Most specialists lean toward a natural origin for Yonaguni's core structure. The question of limited human involvement remains open, but limited is the key word. Nobody serious is arguing this was once a fully built city. That doesn't mean the case is closed. It means the boldest explanation still lacks sufficient evidence, while the least exciting explanation has plenty of it. And even setting the boldest theories aside, real open questions remain. Why do the fractures line up in such consistent right angles, rather than the more chaotic patterns typically seen in similar rock elsewhere? Could some of the most regular-looking sections really have been lightly modified by people, not built from nothing, but subtly reshaped from an existing natural form? Why did this particular stretch of ocean floor produce such a large, coherent result, instead of breaking apart into scattered, shapeless boulders the way most fractured rock does? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question for both sides: how many more decades will it take to either find undeniable tool marks or finally close the case for good? Right now, neither the geologists nor Kimura's supporters have an answer that fully satisfies the other side. And maybe that's the real mystery of Yonaguni. Not who built it, but how easily our minds are willing to see a lost civilization in something that may simply be rock. Rock shaped by millions of years of tectonics into a form that looks unsettlingly familiar. Beneath the water off Japan's westernmost island, the structure is still there. The same stones that have spent nearly 40 years convincing geologists and enthusiasts alike to look at the exact same rock and see two completely different stories. Someday, a future expedition might finally find what's been missing for almost 4 decades. A clear tool mark, a fragment of pottery, a layer that can be reliably dated. And when that happens, the debate will finally tip one way or the other. Until then, anyone who descends to these stones with a tank on their back will have to answer the question themselves. Is this frozen geology, or a forgotten history the ocean simply isn't ready to give up yet?